Someone kept knocking on my door, every night at 3 a.m. The first time it happened, I honestly thought it was just a prank. 3 slow knocks. Not loud, not desperate, just knock, knock, knock. I remember opening my eyes and staring at the clock beside my bed. 3 a.m. I laid there for a few seconds waiting to hear another knock, but the house was completely silent. I lived alone, so there wasn't anyone else who could answer the door. After another minute, I got out of bed and walked downstairs. I looked through the peephole. Nobody. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The street was empty. The neighborhood was one of those quiet suburban communities outside Columbus, Ohio, where almost everyone was asleep by 10 o'clock. Street lights lined both sides of the road, and every house looked nearly identical. There wasn't a single person outside. I stood there for another 30 seconds before going back inside, locking the door, and convincing myself it had probably been teenagers messing around. By morning, I'd almost forgotten about it. I was 28 years old at the time and had just bought my first house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small 2-bedroom home at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. I worked remotely as a graphic designer, which meant I spent most of my time inside the house anyway. The neighborhood seemed perfect. Friendly neighbors, low crime, peaceful. Nothing about it made me think something like this would happen. The second night, it happened again. Exactly at 3 a.m. Knock, knock, knock. This time I reacted immediately. I jumped out of bed, ran downstairs, and looked through the peephole within seconds. Nothing. I unlocked the door and threw it open. The front yard was empty. The sidewalk empty. The road empty. Whoever had knocked would have needed superhuman speed to disappear that quickly. That was the first time I felt something wasn't right. Not because I believed in ghosts or anything supernatural, but because someone had knocked and somehow vanished in less than 10 seconds. I checked both sides of the house before going back inside. Nothing. I barely slept for the rest of the night. The next morning, I mentioned it to my next-door neighbor while we were both getting our mail. His name was Frank. He had to be in his late 60s and had lived on the street longer than anyone else. I laughed as I told him about the late-night knocking, expecting him to say it was probably neighborhood kids. Instead, he frowned. "You actually opened the door?" I shrugged. "Yeah. Why?" He looked at me for a second before shaking his head. "Don't do that again." His answer caught me off guard. "Why not?" "Just don't." Before I could ask anything else, he grabbed his mail and walked back inside his house. The conversation stayed in my head for the rest of the day. It was such a strange response. Not, "Call the police." Not, "Kids have been doing that." Just, "Don't open the door." That night, I decided I wasn't going to let whoever it was mess with me again. Around 11, I turned on the porch light and left it on. I locked every door and checked every window before going to bed. I even left the living room blinds cracked open so I could see the front porch from the hallway. I figured if someone came back, I'd catch them before they had a chance to run away. I must have fallen asleep around midnight. Then, knock. A pause, knock. Another pause, knock. I didn't even need to look at the clock. I already knew what time it was. My phone confirmed it. 3 a.m. This time, instead of running downstairs, I quietly walked to the front window. Keeping myself hidden behind the wall, I slowly pulled one blind aside just enough to look outside. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, at the very end of my driveway, someone was standing there, perfectly still. They weren't facing my house, they were facing the street. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. They wore a dark hoodie with the hood pulled over their head. No movement, no pacing, no looking around. They just stood there. After what felt like 20 seconds, they slowly turned their head. Not toward me, toward the front door. Then, without taking a single step, toward the house. They walked calmly across the street and disappeared into the darkness between two homes. I never heard footsteps. I never heard a car. Nothing. The street became silent again. I stayed awake until sunrise, wondering one thing. If that person had been standing at the end of my driveway, then who knocked on my front door? The next morning, I drove to the nearest hardware store and bought 2 security cameras. One faced the front porch. The other overlooked the driveway. If someone was coming to my house every night, I wanted proof. Setting them up took less than an hour. Both cameras were motion activated and saved recordings directly to my phone. I tested them several times before going inside. Everything worked perfectly. That evening I tried to keep myself busy. I ordered takeout, watched a movie, and kept checking the camera feeds every few minutes. Nothing. By midnight, I started convincing myself the whole thing was over. Maybe whoever had been knocking finally gave up. Around 2:30, I made coffee. There was no way I was sleeping through whatever happened next. I sat in the living room with every light turned off except the TV. The only sounds were the ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. Then, 3 a.m. 3 slow knocks echoed through the house. Knock, knock, knock. This time I didn't move. Instead, I grabbed my phone and opened the live camera feed. The porch camera showed nothing. An empty porch. No person, no movement. I refreshed the feed, still nothing. But the knocking had been so loud, it sounded like someone was standing inches from the front door. I switched to the driveway camera, empty. My heart was racing now. The cameras should have captured anyone walking onto the porch. There was no blind spot, no place to hide. Yet someone had clearly knocked. About a minute later, my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I opened the recording immediately. The video began with an empty porch. Then, without warning, the screen froze. The timestamp stopped moving. 3 seconds later, the recording continued as if nothing had happened. No person appeared, no shadow, nothing. Just an empty porch. I replayed the clip 5 times. Every recording from earlier that day worked perfectly. Only the one recorded at exactly 3 a.m. had frozen. That's when I started wondering if someone wasn't just watching my house. They somehow knew exactly where my cameras were. The following afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about what Frank had said. Don't open the door. It didn't sound like advice anymore. It sounded like experience. After work, I walked over to his house and knocked. He answered after a few seconds, looking surprised to see me. Everything all right? I need to ask you something, I said. Has this happened before? For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he sighed and stepped outside, quietly closing the door behind him. You've been hearing the knocks every night? I nodded. 3 o'clock. Every time. He looked down the street before speaking again. You aren't the first. A chill ran through me. What do you mean? There have been a few families over the years. They all complained about someone knocking in the middle of the night. What happened to them? They moved? Did anyone ever see who it was? Frank slowly shook his head. Not clearly. I frowned. But I saw someone standing at the end of my driveway. He looked at me with an expression I still can't forget. Did you ever see them Walk up to your porch? I thought about it. No. Exactly. I didn't know what he meant by that. Before I could ask another question, he said something that made my stomach tighten. Whatever you do, if you hear the knocks tonight, don't look through the windows. I stared at him. Why? Because if they're still outside when you look, he paused, they'll know you're awake. He refused to explain anything else. I walked back home feeling more unsettled than ever. That night, I locked every door, closed every blind, and turned off every light in the house. For the first time since this started, I wasn't curious anymore. I was afraid. At 2:58 a.m., I was sitting on my couch with every camera feed open on my phone. The house was completely silent. Then my phone vibrated. Motion detected. Backyard camera. My heart skipped. Backyard? I opened the live feed. At first, nothing. The yard was empty, the fence, the trees. Everything looked normal. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The back gate, the one that I always kept latched, was slowly swinging open. No wind, no one visible. Just the gate, opening by itself. A few seconds later, from the front of the house, I heard it again. Knock. A long pause. Knock. Another pause. Knock. This time, someone wasn't just at my front door. Someone had entered my backyard. I didn't move. Every instinct was telling me to grab something and check the backyard. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was. I picked up my phone and called 911. The dispatcher answered almost immediately. 911, what's your emergency? I kept my voice low. I think someone is outside my house. She asked for my address, then told me to stay inside and keep every door locked. I told her about the knocking, the cameras, the backyard gate opening on its own. She said officers were already being dispatched. Do not go outside. I won't. As soon as I hung up, I switched back to the backyard camera. The gate was fully open now. The yard looked empty. Then, a shadow crossed the edge of the camera. It happened so quickly that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. I replayed the live feed. Nothing. The camera hadn't recorded the movement, only I had seen it. Then another notification appeared. Motion detected. Front door camera. I opened it immediately. The porch was empty. No one, just like every other night. Then, the knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. It was impossible. The camera was showing an empty porch while someone was clearly knocking on the front door. For the first time since this all began, I heard something else. Footsteps. Not outside. Inside. A slow creak echoed from the hallway leading toward the kitchen. I froze. The dispatcher was still on the line. Sir, I whispered, I think someone's inside my house. There was a brief pause before she answered. Officers are less than a minute away. Lock yourself in a room immediately. I backed into my bedroom and locked the door. Every sound suddenly seemed louder. The air conditioner, my own breathing, the pounding of my heartbeat. Then, a floorboard creaked directly outside my bedroom. Someone had walked down the hallway. They stopped right outside my door. Complete silence. I held my breath. Then, instead of trying the doorknob, 3 slow knocks came from the other side. Knock, knock, knock. I had never felt fear like that in my life. Moments later, flashing red and blue lights filled my bedroom through the window. I heard officers shouting outside, then footsteps running through the house. The front door burst open. Within seconds, the silence was broken by voices calling out, "Police! Show us your hands." I unlocked my bedroom door only after an officer identified himself. They searched every room, the attic, the basement, the backyard, the woods behind the fence. No one was there. The only thing they found was that my back door had been left slightly open. I know for a fact I had locked it before going to bed. To this day, I still don't know who was knocking on my door every night at 3 a.m. The cameras never captured a single person on my porch. The police never found any fingerprints or footprints. A week later, I packed my belongings and moved out. I never heard the knocks again. But even now, years later, whenever I wake up in the middle of the night, the first thing I do is check the clock. And I always feel relieved when it isn't 3 a.m.